Tonight's speaker is Dr. Danielle Caligari. She is assistant professor in the Department of French and Italian Studies at Dartmouth. She's also a counselor of the Dante Society of America. Her teaching and research focuses on pre-modern Italian literature and food and wine studies. She is published on a variety of subjects, including Dante, medieval food and wine culture, early modern women's writing and religion, and modern Italian food and politics. Her first monograph, Dante's Gluttons, Food and Society in Medieval Italian Literature, is forthcoming from Amsterdam University Press. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and I will turn it over to Dr. Caligari.
Thank you so much, Tricia. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks to everyone for coming. And thank you to New Hampshire Humanities for doing this excellent work. It's my pleasure and privilege to be able to share my research with an audience who's so engaged and with an institution doing exactly what I hope to do with all the time and energy that I put into this, which is sharing with the broadest and most diverse audience possible. So I am going to talk tonight, as Tricia mentioned, about Renaissance chefs in Italy, mostly. But you'll see as I now share my screen with you that I will begin actually in the present and start with some figures that hopefully will be a little bit more famous in order to give us both a point of entry, but also some ways to understand how these reflections on the past bring us into the present and are helpful to us with engaging with questions that remain important. So you'll see that I'm beginning with some faces and names you'll be familiar with. In a 2010 interview with Time, Mario Batali, a chef who became so famous people could recognize him by his footwear alone, admitted, and I quote him, "I hate the word, but it's all about establishing a brand. Because once you have that, all these other opportunities open up and you have this giant soapbox." Batali, we now know, used that same position of power to mistreat and exploit women in his employ, a fact that probably makes him more relevant here, but we'll put a pin in it and get back to where that might lead us later. In a similar interview, the chef known as the Naked Chef at first, Jamie Oliver, now more famous for culinary activism and pictured here bringing school lunches to kids in the UK and later in America, said, and I quote, "At heart, I'm probably no more political than anybody else, but because of what I do, people listen to me." The late Anthony Bourdain showed hard evidence of the kind of traction a celebrity chef could get sitting down to a private one-on-one dinner in Vietnam with then President Obama. Their conversation covered everything from how much they both love Bunchan to current food economies to the lifting of the US arms embargo on Vietnam. Most recently, the chef Daniel Humm of 11 Madison Park in New York, a restaurant multiple times named the best restaurant in the world on the highly anticipated and hotly contested San Pellegrino list, announced that upon reopening post-COVID, his restaurant would serve only plant-based food and drink, posting a photo of himself on Instagram, pictured here, with dirt-covered hands, and noting that it was his responsibility to push the envelope for the world. Lastly, I have to mention, because my title harkens to the series for which Tom Colicchio is famous and which he made famous, Top Chef, who now credits himself or requests to be credited, I should say, as a citizen chef, denoting his intention to raise the status of chef to something greater, making decisions for the community as a whole. I bring in these examples because I'm talking to an American or mostly American audience, and it helps us to have this context, but anyone who knows a little bit about Italy today is probably at least vaguely aware of the fact that this celebrity chef culture very much carries through in the Italian context. the smash success of MasterChef, and we see the crossover right here in the person of Joe Bastianich, who is Italian American and whose fame and position in between the peninsula and the United States has allowed him to bring this franchise back and forth. And included with kind of internationally acclaimed chefs here, focused on a global kind of fame. And then paired with some of the more recent kind of activist positions of the same chefs, Carlo Cracco here, both on MasterChef, but speaking at the Milan Expo in 2015, delivering ideas to huge audiences from all over the map. So in some ways, although we move into an Italian context here, we actually have the opportunity to see the even broader reach of these kinds of figures. A last example here, Massimo Bottura, whose restaurant Osteria Francescana has also been named best in the world repeatedly. Now, not only has people clamoring for reservations at his famous restaurant, but also for his attention to areas that we would consider of great import in terms of public policy, including food waste, as well as the opportunity to feed people in food insecure situations. We take for granted today, to some extent, I would say, the fact that chefs become famous and that they can exercise power and influence social consciousness and even public policy. Not through private wealth or even direct lobbying, but more often by leveraging the rarity and unique nature of their expertise. Everyone eats, but not everyone cooks. And cooking well is a practice that takes care, attention, and training. But traditionally and historically, cooking has not taken place on stage or in front of television cameras. And it was certainly not always the case that the cook, a job still defined in restaurant slang as BOH or back of house, right, would receive accolades from those who were enjoying food in the front of the house. It's worth remembering that the same Anthony Bourdain who sat down to dinner with the president actually first became famous on the back of a book that was about the dark and sad life of professional cooks still today in the late 20th and early 21st century. It does not suggest that there is a clear trajectory towards wealth, power, or success. While today the path forward from chopping and sweating in the kitchen toward having the world ask your advice on how to better itself might not be perfectly clear, the first great chefs had a much greater challenge, let's say, in front of them. They didn't have their names in bright lights. They certainly didn't have bright lights trained upon them, and they did not receive prizes or adoration for their achievements. In fact, their books were not even associated with them directly, right? Their texts came out and might have been circulated, but they themselves were not associated with the production of that text. The traces that we have of their cooking come from recipe collections that tended to be copied anonymously and existing in a few examples. Here I have a particularly beautiful manuscript copy of the Libre de Coquina, which is in itself a copy of an earlier book that we'll see in just a moment. Centuries later, even if we have a detailed understanding of what kind of food was cooking in the kitchen, we know very little about the real person who is actually cooking it. The cook was a servant, paid for his, and I say his advisedly, because the professional cook was almost always male, even if there were women in the kitchens and private home cooks remained female then as now. This was particularly important, or this is important for us to remember when class hierarchy, or in moments where class hierarchy is more formally enforced and the station associated with your birth and the work that you do are harder to manipulate. So the question is then, if I'm looking back at early modern, or even before this pre-modern, medieval Italy, or even a greater European context, and seeing that food itself might have been prized and even fine dining, how did the people behind it begin to harness that and use it to create names for themselves and to gain something from it? The very first cookbooks appear in a vernacular language of any kind. It happened, seem to have been composed in southern Italy in the late 12th or early 13th century. So again, this is not an arbitrary choice. I am an Italianist, but my focus on the idea of using cookbooks as kind of tools of soft power, or using your position as a cook to kind of collect this background and then use it as a foundation to broaden your own potential for power and social mobility, is something that seems to be rooted very specifically in the Italian peninsula of the late Middle Ages. These early cookbooks don't show us the cooks, but they do confirm that despite our stereotypical imaginings of medieval men eating giant legs of roasted meat ripped off the bone and smashing their mugs of mead together, medieval cooking was in fact quite sophisticated and elaborate. And the meals produced in the kitchens of great households were beautiful and complex. I bring here just this is a painting that's on a cassone, which is the wedding chest of a bride from a very well-known aristocratic family from this time. And you can see that this was a meal depicted in the way that would have been appropriate to the station of the woman who received it, right? So the expectation is fine dining, as you can see here, with a great deal of service, with a variety of foods, although they are coming out of the kitchen right now as we see them, and with multi-courses unfolded. These recipes that we later came to understand as absolute classics were codified in these early texts, like the Libre de Coquina, certainly in this case produced in the
Hi, everybody. I think Danielle is frozen. I'm going to give her a second to see if she can get back to us. I thought it might have just been my internet, but I saw a couple of you in the chat.
Everyone's, yeah, is that Zoom that
Oh,
crashed?
there you go.
Can you hear me?
You're
Okay.
back. You're
I'm
back.
back.
Thank you.
Oh, goodness. Zoom. All right.
Okay.
We have it there, right?
There we go. Yep, it's back up.
Great.
Okay.
Okay, apologies. So looking at these texts lets us know that people not only enjoyed food in a certain way and were having kinds of elaborate banquets, etc., but also more than this, that they wanted others to know, right? The things that we inscribe, that we pass on to others and to the future for posterity, are the things that we consider important as a community. So where do we see the connection between the text and the person is the question next, right? How do we get to a point where an individual can be using this and using it to make the position of chef or cook important, and then perhaps even elevating it beyond that? Well, we can start, a good place to start, I would say, is with the figure known as Maestro Martino. Martino da Como is another name that he is known by. This is likely portrait of him, and again a hand manuscript copy of his Libro de Arte Coquinaria. We know that he was born near Milan sometime around 1430. We know that he moved to Rome for the purposes of a career in cooking, working first for a cardinal, Lodovico Trevisan, known for outrageous and lavish banquets. And we know that he eventually moved on to the Vatican. His talent as a chef was considered unparalleled, and his friend, a much more famous and better positioned socially and financially, the famous humanist Bartolomeo Sacchi, called Martino the Prince of Cooks. His work here we see, the Libre de Coquina, circulated extensively and was among the most influential cookbooks to appear on the continent to that point. If you Google him right now, I think Wikipedia still calls him the first celebrity chef, although a wiki might have changed that in the meantime if they heard me talking about it. But for our purposes, what is actually more interesting, I would say, is what we don't know about him, right? And that's why we can look at him as a linchpin. Martino da Como is a person who I can tell you, as you see, about his text. I can tell you where he worked. I can ballpark where he was born and around what time. But I know very little else about him. What we know is that his cooking was considered excellent enough to attract the attention of people who were themselves already well positioned and to create buzz around his book. When we move forward from Martino, we begin to see what happens when that traction is building and how that moves ahead from there. Much more famous, just about a little bit less than a century after him, we have Cristoforo Messis Pugo. His Banchetti, Composizioni di Vivande, etc., is often considered himself the kind of chef that we're looking at when we think about celebrity chef today, not just famous as a chef, but famous as an individual. And you can see here in his case, his text comes out not just not just becoming famous and well circulated like Martino da Como's, but including a frontispiece and a portrait woodcut of the chef himself, so that he becomes literally recognizable, right? People can take his book and see what this man looked like. And if we look at his book, what we can see is someone who is savvy enough to understand what has come before him and what lays in front of him. And that is to say, someone who sees that the food itself isn't the whole game. He needs to be a showman, and he needs to be someone who can attract others toward him, not just for the food he can prepare, but for the lifestyle he can project. In fact, and I'll just give one little kind of sample of his book because it's just so outrageous. He gives a detailed description of a banquet that was held in May of 1529 at the court of the Archbishop of Milan, Ippolito d'Este, the Este family, ultra famous and rich there. As Messis Pugo describes, the meal was preceded first by several performances, a farce, a concert, musicians accompanied by troops of dancers who dance around everyone at the table. He describes all of the table decor and the gardens that are around them. There are 15 freestanding sugar sculptures of the gods set around the diners. As a special surprise, after the 9th course, so they sit down to dinner and have 9 courses brought out to them. As the 9th course is lifted, the tablecloth comes up and the diners find underneath it another full setting, and the banquet begins once again, 9 more courses to be served. Just one course that he gives us here, okay? The second course of the first meal, of the double feast, includes trout patties, halved and spiced hard-boiled eggs, sturgeon roe, pike spleens, other fish offal fried with orange, cinnamon, and sugar, boiled sturgeon with garlic sauce, the fish itself emblazoned with the cardinal's device, fried bream, soup, pizza with flaky pastry, Catalan style, small fried fish from the River Po, and that's not it. I'm just going to cut it off there so I don't only list foods for the duration of my lecture, right? This is what's happening, and what Messis Pugo is doing here is giving a narrative, right? It's not just a series of things that one might cook, it's how people lived and how you might emulate that, right? So the significance of the banchetti doesn't lie into the insight just of the kind of intricate and advanced nature of 16th century Italian dining. If we look closely at the text itself and that narrative, we also find other hints of someone understanding how to weaponize this, right? Or that might be ungenerous, but at least how to take fullest advantage of the genre. Messis Pugo dedicates his text to the cardinal Ippolito d'Este, right? He says to him, I'm not going to, and he actually has a long letter in the beginning in which he says, you know, you're such an honorable and incredible gentleman of such great talents and importance in this world. I hesitate to give you a cookbook, which feels beneath you, but he qualifies that, right? He says, now, just to be clear, while this text is a product of my basso e rozzo ingegno, my scarce and clumsy talent, I'm not going to waste time, he says, a descrivere minestre d'ortaggi e legumi, che son cose da vile femminuccia. I'm not going to describe roughage soups and bean dishes, which are for common women in the kitchens of anyone's house, right? This is how people of status, people of power live, and I'm going to not only let you in on it who already knows, but anyone who is lucky enough to eventually access this text. And let's be clear, Messis Pugo meets with great success. He, in fact, has made a Count Palatine not a very substantial title at the time, let's say. And he maintains the title until after, in fact, until his own death. So even after his patron dies, he doesn't have to fight to kind of continue to wield that power, to have that social status. What makes both of these examples, Maestro Martino and Cristoforo Messis Pugo, most interesting is that they clearly themselves then give rise to a kind of explosion at this time of further texts and people who understand what can be built upon here. And if we look ahead, I have a series of just a few examples that became particularly famous. The opera of Bartolomeo Scapi, the Singolare Dottrina of Domenico Romoli, and the On the Scalco by Giovan Battista Rossetti. What's happening here? Why is this so interesting? These chefs are understanding that there's more to food, right? There's more to food than simply enjoying what you eat, or even more simply being nourished. It's a means of communicating. And if it is used well, it can be used to elevate the individual, or perhaps even more than that. In fact, Martino and Messis Pugo hoped for and succeeded in advancing individual careers in a transparent and rigid hierarchy of their time. But of course, this is something that we can anachronistically not be surprised by because of the place that we started, right? Their work would pave the way not only for celebrity chef culture, but much more than that, the more subtle exploitation of food culture and recipe collections in the realm of politics. And I want to leave lots of time for questions, but I do want to give just one particularly good example here of a cookbook that became extremely famous in Italy, and that had a value to Italian identity that went far beyond what anyone would have imagined a cookbook and a cook could potentially do. And that is, of course, the Science in the Kitchen and the Art of Eating Well of Pellegrino Artusi, self-published in 1891, just after Italy had been unified, first as a kingdom in 1861, and slowly moving towards what would eventually become the republic we know following World War II, and and a text that would become the most popular cookbook ever in Italy, still today, almost certainly, although it depends how you adjust for inflation. Um, Science in the Kitchen and the Art of Eating Well is a cookbook by modern standards. So we make the leap here from these medieval texts that are kind of more manuals and detached from the person behind them towards, and then, making the step in the Renaissance towards chefs who have texts and we know them and they want us to know them and they use them in this very conscious way. And now into the 19th century, where we see someone who is an individual attached to his cookbook, but what he's interested in doing here is not just elevating himself, but actually creating a common identity that can then be projected. He's creating Italians for the newly created Italy. This Science in the Kitchen and Art of Eating Well is a work that became a fundamental source for Italian home cooks, as well as the ultimate representative of Italian cuisine to an international public, although later that would be supplanted by another example or others that we can talk about together. Artusi's text brought to light the rich Italian culinary history that had been obscured by the passage of time and the dullness of Romantic era cooking in Italy. Artusi also emphasized that same Italian Renaissance court space and the richness of that banqueting culture that we talked about as the ancestor of avant-garde cuisine. And affirming that French dominance in the 18th century culinary world actually owed all of its greatness to earlier Italian archetypes. And then he did this in a space where an average home cook felt comfortable. Artusi gives very clear instructions. He talks about himself making mistakes in the kitchen. He even writes a little bit about how his cats were his first tasters and they rubbed themselves up against his legs when they smelled that dinner was ready, right? So he's very personable, right? Again, understanding how food can communicate in this way and become intimate as well. And this quaint and kind of seemingly old-fashioned nature of Artusi's Science in the Kitchen, Art of Eating Well has often led readers to think that it was neither the product of a great chef nor a great thinker. But the depth of this project, if we put it into this greater historical context, becomes clear to us, right? The Art of Eating Well is Italian recipes written in Italian, addressed to Italians. It is called later by scholars a text that is a kind of response to the abdication of Italians in the realm of culture in the post-Renaissance period, a moment where there could be pride that was built upon and that could be kind of handed off to citizens of Italy, the newly formed Italy, but then also projected beyond the peninsula. Artusi, in fact, manages, in keeping with earlier usage of Italian cookbooks, to give this cookbook a kind of political heft, right? His work is the climax of a conscious effort to renew Italian interest and pride in cooking to complete the Risorgimento campaign, convincing home cooks that recipes from all regions of Italy were part of a shared repository of Italian cuisine and could be something that any one of them could master and then show off with in their home to other people who came over or to eventually wider audiences. He continues the work of unifying the country by integrating Italian cuisine, evoking a glorious past, but also giving space to a much more diverse new Italy. Of course, Artusi was not actually a chef, which makes everything about this the most interesting possibility, right? By the time we get to the 19th and 20th century, we're now looking at people who are no longer so concerned with elevating the station of the vocation, but more instead understanding how the moving parts can be put together, drawn together, and used to wield a kind of tool that is both intimate and universal. And um, I'll let us more or less conclude there, thinking about the fact that as Artusi gives us this example, we can see the genre of cookbooks and cooking as a practice growing to have a kind of life of its own, the way we see celebrity growing around people who are not formally chefs today, but nonetheless harness the power of food and the media that is generated around it to gain fame, fortune, to change minds across a much broader swath of our community than we might think. To make social change for good or bad often, right? As we saw in the earliest recipe collections, sometimes the lack of a humanizing presence of the chefs who conceived and executed the recipes makes the books or the food itself less powerful. And yet, if we move ourselves into the 20th and 21st century, I think we could have quite a dynamic debate about what we take from that rich past and what has now been moved into a new and possibly untraceable space. I'll leave off just with the last thing that I wrote about myself, thinking about the power of the cook and cookbooks and the question of profession versus professional chef versus home cook, in the figure of Marcella Hazan, who is widely credited with bringing modern Italian cooking to America, at least, and lauded as a great writer of cookbooks more than chef or cook in some ways, right? She was not trained in that way, and she did not necessarily expect to make her living off of this. She instead had an acuity for how the food that she wanted to have in her own home could be communicated to others, and then how that could move beyond that private space into a public sphere. And I conclude with her also because I began with a series of chefs who are the faces and names that we might be most familiar with right now, all of whom are men, and white for that matter, and all of whom are able to, or perhaps we could consider that, able to use that power a little bit more freely. One of the greatest complaints surrounding Marcella Hazan's cookbooks is that they are bossy, right? The tone comes off as unwelcome to readers at times. So thinking about that as a kind of last space for us to imagine how this past of understanding how food and the text in which it is encoded can communicate much more than a history of eating and fine dining, and understanding how we ourselves read it and then are changed by it. I look forward to having your questions, and I thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Caligari. So anyone who wants to ask a question, you can use the chat function and type your question into the chat. Or if you want to ask your question, you can use the raise hand feature, which if you hover over or you click on the three dots, the ellipses by your name in your little square of you, you'll see the option to raise your hand. So I'll call on those people when they raise their hand, so you can type your questions into the chat. But I'm going to start with a question, which was, I enjoyed the quote about what, this isn't what common women were eating. Can you tell us what do we know about what people, medieval and early modern Italians were eating? What would be that food of common women that he was kind of derisively referring?
Yeah. So a couple of things. The first important thing to point out is that most of the foods that we associate with kind of common Italian cuisine today, the most iconic dishes, would not have been part of the diet at that time. Pasta, definitely not. Pizza, not the way that we see it now. A series of other kind of broadly understood Italian things were just not on the table. And of course, at Mrs. Pugo's time, we're post-Columbian exchange, so tomatoes are available, but they're not commonly used, and they're not certainly not part of what we would call popular cuisine in the sense of kind of common to all. The minestre or brodi, or the kind of soups and things that Mrs. Pugo describes as the things that he won't be talking about, are absolutely what most people were eating regularly, and what most people ate well beyond his own time into the 20th century. It's not until really after the World War II, so mid 20th century, that the Italian diet across the board changes substantially to include things like regular animal protein and especially industrial pasta. Before that, you're much more likely to see people consuming things in the form that Mrs. Pugo is unimpressed with, not least because, as his book describes, and as the other texts that I show you described, in order to produce a banquet like that, you needed to have a full household staff, a substantial amount of equipment and space. Most of these families were actually borrowing from other rich families when they wanted to host, right? They didn't even have all of their own things on hand. They would have, especially things like chairs and table settings. They were bringing in these things for the moment. So the average meal was both more limited and far less, or I should say, and at a distance from the things that we associate with Italianness today.
Yeah, and I see Kevin has a hand up, so I'm going to let you unmute there.
Hi. Hi, Danielle. Dedicated Goloso here. But wanted to ask, just sort of generally, you talked about the food canon of Italy, but it is incredibly hyper regional. So given today's modern look at it, who's out there currently in your mind really defining what this sort of Italian what the Italian food panoply is? What is the common cookbook? What is the common stuff? Who's carrying that torch these days, given that finding a good plate of carbonara in Napoli was nearly impossible, and it's only an hour from Rome?
Yeah, well, I think they probably wear that as a badge of honor more than anything else. Well, I think, again, what we're talking about is something that I tried to draw out a little bit here in terms of the distinctions in class and the associations with certain spaces, right? So a cook wasn't part of a kind of elevated cultural space, but we see people understanding how they might use their talents and their skills to bring themselves into that social, into that kind of higher social ranking. And we can transpose that or translate it into a contemporary context. I use the example of Massimo Bottura. I hate to constantly go back to him, but you have to, right? Because everyone is all the time. So if you're one of the people who's plugged into fine dining in Italy and to this kind of wider reaching even culture of celebrity, there are a handful of people who are the absolute, and I use it in the mathematical sense of the term, points of reference, right, with nothing around them. So Cracco, if you're in Italy, is so important, not just because he owns a Michelin-starred restaurant and because he is you know, been on the cutting edge of what people are cooking, or how they might be experimenting with innovation in Italian cuisine, but also because his face is everywhere. If you walk around, it's on billboards. He's eating a patatine, right? He's on MasterChef. He's on all of the shows. He's the commentator. He's the talking head for everything. He was at, you know, I used the example of him at the expo. He'll be at the next one, right? So there's that part of it where you see a very kind of specific idea that is mostly actually about pushing back against tradition in some ways, or finding a kernel of it and then, you know, bringing that into this much more dynamic space. And then there's the other level that tends to be hyper regional, and you have people hanging on to the ideas of food where, again, right, we're looking at, you know, carbonara is always a great example, but any of these dishes that where people say, you know, there's one version of it that is the version, but of course, you know, they act like it's rooted in this deep history. Well, as a medievalist, you know, I have to, there's little I can do with that because they're talking about something that's from maybe 100 years ago. So as soon as I get back to when I'm looking at, it's totally irrelevant, right? I mean, it just has there's nothing there for me. So I think, you know, we're looking at different spaces in the abstract sense all the time. You know, what is the vision of fine dining in Italy today? What Italy wants to be known for all'estero, outside of Italy? What are people at a kind of local level hanging on to? And then what's happening economically at the same time? Because of course, in the, you know, we're about to see a new, much more severe economic depression than even the one before it, almost certainly as a result of COVID. And that'll mean that the things that happened last time as a result of that will be exacerbated. People will eat more poorly than before. They will eat more prepackaged things probably. They will eat more fast foods. They will eat more empty carbohydrates. You know, that same dish of carbonara will be 150 grams of pasta and much less of any of the other things that you might have had in following to create that full meal and the narrative. So I think, you know, in that as a last point there, we may find out how that's going to be defined now. Yeah, thank you, Kevin.
Thanks.
A question in the chat asked if Artusi's book is available in English. Is it in English?
Yes, it has been translated as Science in the Kitchen and the Art of Eating Well, with an introduction by Luigi Ballerini. I believe it is widely available, certainly in libraries. I'm not sure if there's a fresh print run out right now, but you could certainly get a used one. And if you go to your local bookshop, as I always encourage you to, you may find that they can order one for you through one of their networks.
Excellent. And a question from Rose in the chat asked, did Italy have pizza in the 16th century?
You know, big asterisk here. Depends how you define pizza. If you define pizza as hot bread with something on it, then yes. If you define it as the pizza napoletana that the Vera Associazione does now, no. And everything in between. So the other thing is that the word pizza is used much more flexibly in Italian historically. So pizza, you know, like I grew up with a Sicilian grandmother who, for her, pizza was actually a pie, and right, the closer to what we would Americans might think of it as looking like Chicago deep dish pizza, because it was in a pan like that, filled with meat and cheese, and then with a pastry top covering. So that was pizza to her, and pizza can be anything like that. So it's a very broad term that historically and regionally appears in all different kinds of ways.
Thank you. And I have to editorialize here and just say, I think that the whole state of New Hampshire defines pizza in a way that is very unfamiliar to me as someone who grew up in New York State. But I see Professor Parity is on, and I'm going to ask her to unmute. She has her hand raised.
Hi, Danielle. Thank you for your talk. I have two very quick questions. The first one is it really true that Maria de' Medici is the Italian who brought Italian recipes to France and therefore engendered French cuisine? The second part is, can you talk a little bit about slow food and the impact it has on celebrity chefs?
Yeah, so I think the idea of the Medici marriage into the French monarchy as the transition moment is inevitably reductive. There's been both a lot of reliance on that, and then a lot of pushback in critical literature. I think I probably take a place myself somewhere in the middle of it. It's fair to say that having a, let's use another example. When Eleonora di Toledo married into the Medici family, so this is a Spanish princess coming into Italy, as opposed to an Italian duchess going into France, right? When Eleonora di Toledo came to Italy, she brought with her many kind of pieces of culture that she consciously tried to infuse into her presence there and to use as part of her self-fashioning. And no doubt Caterina de' Medici did exactly the same thing going to France. On the other hand, the idea that a single person did anything like that, I think, is also just kind of a modernist anachronism, because it's based on the idea that there was, somehow very little cultural exchange other than when one person gathered up all their forks and knives and went to another country. Of course, all of these people were, dining together for exactly the reasons that we're talking about here, for diplomatic reasons, for, all the time. So there was a lot of exchange, and there are many texts that talk about that, and there are people who visit expressly for those reasons, right? There are Italians who travel the continent writing down the things they see people eating and drinking and bringing them back. Ortensio Lando is a famous example of that within the peninsula and beyond.
I think Danielle's frozen again. We'll give her a second to come back. We've got a few more questions in the chat, so I want to see if we can get to those if Danielle comes back here. She's back.
Thank you. I'm sorry. The next thing I needed to say was to respond to slow food, and which Graziella was asking about, but I also noticed was in the chat. The influence of slow food, I think, is substantial, period. I think there has been a lot of work done on through the slow food program at the with regard to education that has had now I think has gone through a kind of a full generation, and so we see people who have gone through formal programs that have focused curricula. I think that there is a lot of interest at the level of people who are working professionally in food right now in the kinds of things that slow food is a proponent of, even if they're not personally aligned with the program specifically. But I also think that slow food is one of those things that has been possibly even more successful outside of Italy, because it or with the in the space where Italy projects itself for other places. And Italy has been very successful at convincing everyone that the average Italian continues to eat in a very kind of authentic, traditional, abundant specific way that is extremely caring and careful, thoughtful, that there's always a time that you take off from, you have long leisurely lunches before, a nap and going back to the office, and then late meals. And there is some of that, but as I can see, the people who are living or have lived in Italy are either shaking their heads or sending messages about how ridiculous that is, right? In fact, in urban centers in Italy, especially young people, most people have a long commute to work. They work a long day. They don't eat particularly well during the day. They come home and they throw something together, and they don't have a ton of disposable income anymore either. And so the result of all of that is that, slow food has this really shiny patina, but that it is what it's pushing back against is not often visible even to the people who are pushing back against it, right? And the degradation of that culinary culture and the space of psychological and physical wellness that goes along with it.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you. Couple more questions from the chat. Penelope asked, what difference was there between the development of cuisine in Italy versus France?
The huge difference is that there's a centralized monarchy in place in France earlier that allows there to be a kind of codified French, capital F, cuisine before there is an Italian one, because Italy is a cultural space, but not a political space. It's not a nation state until much later. And so having a set of rules and foods that are Italian comes later and really never to that point, right? And so that makes it a lot easier for people to understand what French cuisine is, for it to be exported and emulated in other places. There are lots of other things that we could add there to that debate, but that will become very unwieldy. So I'll leave it there.
Here's another question in the chat from Jackie. She writes, in Italy, and especially post-pandemic, aren't the home cuisines and farmstead cooks the original celebrity chefs that have influenced maybe even the most modernist heavyweights in food culture today? What is the future of the idea of celebrity chef?
This is a great question. The first thing that I would say about that is I think that's definitely true. I think that's where many of these chefs go for ideas, or where they cut their chops a lot of times initially. It is also the place they point to when they give their origin stories, right? They always learned from an old lady in a barn somewhere, rolling out, single pieces of pasta, sweating laboriously over these dishes. That said, they don't pull those people up with them, right? They might go so far as to cite the name in the course of conversation, but those people aren't in their kitchens, and those people are not they do not recreate that experience in their spaces, right? When you go to the restaurants of the chefs that we're talking about, it's not like eating in a comfortable, laid-back trattoria. And that's not necessarily because of them. It's more complicated than that. But, it becomes a cycle, right? If you're going to produce at this level, it becomes expensive. Your diners then are paying a lot of money. They may be traveling far in order to see you. They have very high expectations. In order to have the kind of service that matches those expectations, you're also having to invest a lot. The atmosphere is changed by that. It becomes charged, and et cetera. And you get to a point where, if I'm spending 300 euros for a single meal, can I possibly, how do I put that together with that more ostensibly, in scare quotes, authentic space that is unfortunately not supported by that apparatus? The future of celebrity chef, I think, is probably somewhere to be found in TikTok, right? In these spaces of people who are experimenting, faster and with a wider audience than ever before, and without needing the huge amount of investment that chefs needed until very recently in order to have that global stage. So the individuals we talked about here are people who understood that in order to wield that or to have that soapbox, as we started with, or to wield that that tool, they needed to immediately capitalize upon their success, roll it into a franchise and into a series of other means of making money, often products for the kitchen and beyond, and then use that money to sustain a kind of mini empire that that becomes a feedback loop on itself. Yeah.
Thank you. So one last question in the chat from Katie, which is, can you comment on the lack of gender parity in the celebrity chef category and the concept of quota rosa?
The quota rosa is a term that was, I think, very first used in politics and then has been used across the board now, meaning the amount of women in any particular space and trying to ostensibly achieve gender parity in any of those given spaces. This has been an unsuccessful experiment in Italy as well as everywhere, period, basically. There's not, there aren't too many good examples. In the food world, this has come to the attention of people more than ever recently because of the kinds of wider debates we're having about how successful civil rights has been in our country and elsewhere, and how supported people are by the same systems. I think the total lack of women, particularly in Italian kitchens, I do think it's a little bit worse. I hesitate to say that because it's always a grass is greener situation, but I do think it's a little bit worse. It's bad everywhere. I think I would give two reasons off the board, starting with the one that I just provided, which is lack of investment. It's you're talking about opening a successful restaurant in a major urban center in Italy or the US right now. If you have less than a few $1 million is impossible. And frankly, with a few $1 million, you're still up against some really improbable odds, as witnessed by this year, which decimated the hospitality world, including places that were very successful up until that moment. So the risk is high, the reward is low, and historically, women have not been able to get investment. There's actual legislation in place that made that possible, right? There are people on this call right now who would not have been allowed to get their own credit cards, that would not have been allowed to sign for their own apartment, who would not have been allowed to take out student loans, let alone business loans or equity lines. So there are, actual full stop obstacles in place, but then there are traditions and the way that people get money, and a lot of that comes with the lifestyle. So people in hospitality go out late, they hang out drinking and shooting the shit, and that's when they make the kinds of relationships that include the offer of money and support. And women have been excluded from those places historically and again systematically. There's another side of it, which has to do with the militarization of the kitchen space and the idea that it's not a place for women. Speaking of the success of French cuisine, right? The brigade, the idea that the chef is not just the boss, but the general, and everyone beneath that is working in a kind of position on which the whole is hugely dependent and there can be no distraction. And the suggestion has always been that women cannot be in a place like that for lots of reasons. We could go on there, and there are lots of other sides of the debate, but just to answer the question of why the numbers remain low, those are some examples I could give you. We could also certainly talk about how those systems are being pushed back against or broken down as well.
That was an excellent answer. Thank you. So we were pretty much out of time and I don't see any other questions coming in, but I want to thank Dr. Caligari for this talk tonight and for answering all these questions. They were great questions. And I hope that you'll come back when your book is out and maybe tell us about Dante as well. And then I also am just realizing that you're a certified specialist of wine, and perhaps we can also have you come back and talk to us about the history of wine.
Absolutely, anytime.
Great. So thank you very much to Dr. Caligari. Thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. You can learn more about our work by visiting our website. You'll find upcoming talks and a link to sign up for our newsletter. After tonight's program, you'll also get an email with a link to take a survey, and we appreciate your feedback. So thank you, and we hope that we'll see you again in upcoming programs. Thank you, everyone.